Hi everyone, and welcome to this video all about paper 2 question 4 for AQA English Language GCSE. This question is all about comparing writers' perspectives. So I want to say that I'm not going to be using any GCSE extracts for this video. It's just going to be an introduction to the skills that you need to demonstrate for this task, as well as how to approach this task. So the aims of the session are these: to remind you of the key principles of this task, question 4, as well as remind you as well why this task is different to question 2, because sometimes students struggle to tell the difference and they end up writing the same response for both 2 and 4. What I have used in my teaching, in my lessons over the years, is TripAdvisor reviews about hotels as mini texts, really, to practice being able to pinpoint what writers think about a certain thing, and to pinpoint writers' attitudes, but also to think about writers' methods, which are language. I'm going to introduce to you as well what I call the feelings wheel, which is not a resource that I created, but a resource that I have used quite accurately actually over the years, has helped students in order to practice being able to pinpoint writers' feelings and their attitudes about something. And I'm going to finish this session by showing you an example of how these skills are all brought together in a response, and I've colour-coded it as well to help. So to start with, why is question 4 different to question 2? Obviously the same paper. Both questions are comparisons because they are looking at both sources. So there is a very sometimes hard to find line between them, but there is a difference, and you should not end up writing the same response for both. Question 2 is 8 marks, and it will always be a comparison question of the factual similarities or differences between something in both extracts. Question 4, though, is more interested in the writer's own viewpoints. It's about what the writer thinks and feels about what they're talking about. So for question 4, you're comparing their thoughts. For question 2, you're comparing, something factual. So to give you an example in the table at the bottom, let's imagine you have 2 extracts. One is from 21st century, source A, and one is from Victorian times, source B. And they're both about healthcare, they're both about hospital treatments. And the question for question 2 is summarise the differences between 2 hospitals. So one hospital has a big waiting room, one has a small waiting room, one has 5 doctors, one has 7, one specialises in eye treatment, the other in stomach problems. You can imagine lots of different differences or similarities between the 2 hospitals. However, for question 4, it is not so much about the hospitals anymore, but what the writer thinks about visiting those hospitals. One writer might really like it, one might be fearful because they hate needles, one might not like it because they don't like blood. So question 4, you can see you're still talking about the hospitals, but it's now what the opinion or the thoughts of the writers are about that hospital. So there's a difference here. Another example, let's imagine that you have 2 extracts about education, one from the 21st century, one from Victorian time, and looking at how education has changed over the years or stayed the same. So for question 2, you can imagine being asked, summarise the differences between, or summarise the similarities between both schools. One school is in Kent, one is in Oxford. One teaches English on a Thursday, the other teaches English on a Monday. One has a big playground, one has a small playground, and so on. Just thinking off the top of my head. So that's all about the schools. However, for question 4, still talking about those schools, remember, but it's not anymore about the schools, it's about what the writers think of those schools. So they might have reflecting on the memories of their school days. So compare the writers' differing attitudes about going to school. So one writer might really like school, become a teacher because of it. One might not like school at all, perhaps they were bullied, and they want to get as far away from it as possible. So there is a difference between question 2 and question 4. So for this video, it's all about the writer's perspectives or their opinions. And in this sense, we get into kind of the wording or the semantics of this question. It will always be about these 4 things: opinions, perspective, attitudes, viewpoints. They all mean the same thing. And if you flick back through historical past papers, this word tends to change in each question. But essentially, you're always looking at the same thing: a writer's approach to something, their opinions, their perspectives, their attitudes, or their viewpoints. So what you're comparing for this question is their own response, their own opinions, their own attitudes to this, how they have reacted to something in their own mind. The feelings wheel is this, and what I do with students is I print this off for them and I ask them to highlight sections of this to help tell the difference between two writers' attitudes. So in the middle we've got very simple words, and then in the kind of the middle ring we have slightly more complex words, and then in the outer ring even more complex words. So I say to students, the more words you can pick from the outer ring, the more specific your response might be. So these are all adjectives really that we would use to describe somebody and to describe somebody's thinking process. So I'm just looking at the left-hand side here. Somebody might be worried, somebody might be frightened, terrified, dismayed, perplexed, and so on. And these are the words really that you need to be including in your question 4 response, because this is going to be showing the examiner that you are comparing their perspectives. You're going to be comparing what they think of what they're talking about. Okay, so going back to those previous examples, one writer might have a kind of worried attitude about hospital. The other might have perhaps a more optimistic attitude about hospital. So you are comparing what they think of what they're talking about. Okay, so that feelings wheel can sometimes be useful in prompting that response. We need to be using these words, or some of them, in our response to show the exam that we are comparing what writers think and feel. So in summary then, paper 2 question 4, obviously paper 2 comparison, you're being asked to look at 2 inserts and therefore there's going to be a comparison element to it. Opinions, attitudes, viewpoints and perspectives are the main words to be using for this question. The language is going to be the clue to that. So they're not in the room with us, these writers. They cannot tell us verbally what they think. So their language is going to naturally reflect what they think. So if they are going to have a very angry attitude, they're going to use lots of angry words. If they have a more sorrowful or sad tone or perspective, then they're going to use language to reflect that. So the language is going to be the clue as to if they have a sarcastic or surprised or disgusted attitude. So we need to, again, be thinking about the writer's methods and tying that into our response. It's worth bearing in mind that there are some extracts out there where the viewpoints can change. Sometimes viewpoints don't stay the same. There's an extract out there about Glastonbury, and a woman called Elizabeth Day is sent to Glastonbury by her newspaper because she's a journalist. And she travels down and she thinks she's going to hate it because she has believed that it's all about mud and chaos and lack of toilets and things. She actually ends up rather liking Glastonbury. She kind of admits that it has a charm. So that's one example of where extracts can have a change in viewpoint. So if you can pick up on that change of opinion or nuances in what they think, that will also get you some marks. Generally though, viewpoints in each extract can be different, entirely different, slightly different, or the same. So sometimes, a writer's view might be very similar actually, and there are very small nuances in their viewpoints. As I've said there, the best responses will tie in the language analysis because it's the language that will give us a clue as to what they think. And it's important to embed quotes as always, connectives perhaps because you're comparing, words like however, furthermore, in contrast, and inference. So you've got to really try and get into the writer's mind again. Why do you think they have this attitude? Why do you think they feel angry? Why are they annoyed? Why are they judgmental? Why are they optimistic or sad? So putting yourself in their shoes might help you expand on why perhaps they feel the way they do. And it's 16 marks, which means you're writing for about 20 minutes for this question. Okay, so that's what we know about paper 2 question 4. So what I have used in the past is I have used TripAdvisor reviews. And for those of you who don't know what TripAdvisor is, it's a review site where people can review hotels predominantly. We live in a very review-orientated society. Before we buy a product on Amazon, we read a review. We read a review of the comments, perhaps on YouTube videos, before we watch it ourselves. We read reviews of TripAdvisor before we book a hotel because we don't want to spend money on an awful place. So I want us to imagine that the question for question 4 is compare the writer's different perspectives of their hotel stay. So we have 2 writers here who have stayed in the same hotel, let's say, and they are writing of their opinions of their stay after they have left. So you can see for this question, I've got Q plus WM plus FW plus DC. That's kind of my own little formula. Quotes plus writer's methods plus feelings wheels plus detailed comments. And all of that is brought together to equal a good response. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to progress through these two reviews kind of slowly, starting to build our knowledge of them so we know what we need to include in the question 4 response. So this hotelier, this hotel guest I should say, gave this hotel 1 star. I've deliberately not included the hotel name because they probably wouldn't like me very much. But the review says very poor, owner has terrible attitude. And the guest says, I booked to stay and my paperwork clearly stated it included breakfast on arrival. Told no breakfast unless I paid another £10. Owner said not his fault, but error on website. What a poor attitude. I had booked in good faith, but looking at room, I shouldn't have been surprised. Barely clean, the smallest TV with awful reception, so couldn't watch most channels. Light seeping in from around curtains and door, very noisy, shower temperature all over the place, threadbare towels. Basically no redeeming features, the worst hotel I have stayed. For years I will never stay again and advise you to stay elsewhere. Truly awful. Okay, so if I was to ask you now, what is the writer's attitude about the hotel? Clearly it's a big negative sign. They don't like it. Why do we know that? We know that because of the language. Okay, not particularly well written, I must say, from an English teacher's perspective, but you get the gist. They don't like it. They haven't had a very nice stay, and it's the language that has shown that. So for Q, we need to identify the quotes, and I highlighted these. Words like barely, smallest, awful, truly awful at the bottom, threadbare, and he says that the light was seeping in from around the curtains and the door. There are other things as well, but we can't quote everything. I want to be selective. So for Q, we have highlighted here things that we would talk about perhaps to prove that the writer's perspective or attitude of this hotel isn't particularly great. Next, writer's methods, WM, we need to label our devices because we need to show an awareness that language is at play here. Language analysis, language manipulation is at play. The writer has deliberately chosen vocabulary to present his negative attitude. And I like question 4 in doing this task because it shows that English isn't just relevant to a classroom. English is out there in society. So if you ever stay in an awful hotel, you might end up one day writing a review. You'll be drawing on your English skills to do that. Because if you hate somewhere, you're not going to be using positive language. Okay, so we've got an adverb barely, lots of adjectives, smallest, awful, repetition of awful at the end, threadbare, meaning kind of worn. We've then got a metaphor, the light was seeping in from around the curtains and the door as if it's like water. And we've got that verb seeping, which isn't necessarily a nice verb either. So without even knowing it, the writer has actually used some devices that we can pick up on. Okay, and this is why language can sometimes be very unconscious. We don't even think about using our language sometimes, we just do it. But from an English perspective, with our language analysis hats on, language analysis is at play here. We've now got to think about the feelings wheel. So I've just added in red here some words that we could use to describe the attitude of this writer. The writer is disgusted, judgmental, critical, annoyed, disappointed at this hotel. And we need to tie those words in to the response because that means we are comparing the perspectives. Okay? Remember, we're not interested so much in the hotel, we're interested in what the writer thinks of the hotel. So there's a slight difference here between the two questions. So that's source A. Okay, we're now going to go on to source B. All right, so same question, different extract. I've blanked out the hotel name here. And this same hotel, believe it or not, but this guest gave it 5 stars. So something that the first writer didn't see, obviously. So it says wedding. Recently stayed at the hotel for a wedding. Dave, the owner, manager, really done us proud. The wedding reception was excellent in all ways. Great setting, and the food was excellent, main meal and evening buffet. The waiting staff were very good. You can tell Dave runs a tight ship. The overnight stay was fine. Clean, spacious rooms and bathrooms, very large with plenty of hot water. Please bear in mind this hotel building dates back to the 1700s and it is not all shiny chrome and plastic but has some lovely period features, wood panelling, etc. A great location, being in the centre of town, never experienced any noise, although I stayed during one of England's World Cups, so you would expect it maybe to be noisy. Again, not perfectly written, probably slightly better written than the last one, perhaps. But again, we need to go across the same process. So quotes. What quotes could we use to prove that the writer's perspective is more positive in this one? So excellent, great, fine, clean, spacious, tight ship, excellent again, great again. So clearly it's the language that's given us a clue into what they think. Clearly, same hotel, completely different attitude about it. Okay, so complete difference. Now the quotes or the language, we've got adjectives, repetition of excellent, repetition of great. We have got list of 3, fine, clean, spacious. We've got the imperative, please bear in mind. So they're warning potential guests that it's not modern, it has some period features. We've got the metaphor in it being compared to a tight ship, which means that it's kind of very organised, everything has its place. And obviously this is for a wedding, so you would want it to be as stress-free as possible because a wedding is as stressful enough as it is. And then finally we need to think about FW, our feelings wheel. Content, pleased, satisfied, complimentary. Completely different part of the feelings wheel. So we're going to compare those red words to source B with the red words for source A. So we have completely different attitudes here about the same hotel. Okay. We now need to think about DC, which is now starting to develop detailed comments. So what can we think about? So I've got a table here. The writer has this attitude because in source A, the hotel was dirty, had poor facilities, they had to pay extra for breakfast when they thought it was included in the overall cost. The owner was rude, perhaps, and they also say it wasn't dark enough to sleep. So we need to include that in our response as well. We also, for source B, need to think about, well, why does the writer of source B have a different attitude? Well, they say the hotel was excellent, had good food, clean, large rooms, a nice location, the staff were well organised and probably friendly, but it was also for a wedding reception. So obviously it's a very important day and you don't want any extra stress from that. So it went really well. So thankfully the hotel did its job properly and it didn't add to the stress of the day. So we need to tie that in to the response as well. Okay. So the final slide really is all about putting it all together. So here we have a completed response, and you can see I've color-coded. So quotes in blue, methods in green, and attitudes in yellow. And you can see that it all fits together in like a patchwork of information. And around those blocks of colour, in the bits that haven't been highlighted, is really where the candidate has expanded on why they think the writer has those views. So it says both writers express differing perspectives regarding their hotel stays in their reviews. In source A, the writer presents a critical, judgmental and annoyed attitude about the hotel. This is shown through the use of the superlative adjective smallest when complaining about the size of the TV, as if it was inadequate for the cost of the room or for its size. As well as this, the adjective threadbare in describing the towels, giving connotations of torn rags, unsuitable for use and certainly not what they expected for a hotel taking their money. The repetition of awful reinforces the fact they believe the hotel was unpleasant and dirty, not what they expected because it wasn't value for money, because of poor facilities such as a noisy shower. The writer also expresses shock and annoyance when they found out that they had to pay extra for breakfast and it wasn't included in the cost of the stay. Clearly, the writer believes that the hotel should provide breakfast without extra money and resents the fact that they will have to spend more money there. In contrast, the writer of source B expresses a complimentary and satisfied attitude of their hotel stay, evidenced through the repetition of the adjectives excellent and great, as well as the list of 3, fine, clean, spacious, which foregrounds the writer's contented and satisfied opinion of their stay. The metaphor in which the hotel is compared to a tight ship suggests that the writer is pleased that, despite a chaotic wedding reception where many things could go wrong, everything went to plan and was very organised, which lessened the sense of stress for this important occasion. The attitude presented by the writer of source B is also very complementary than source A because of the friendliness of the staff, including the manager. In contrast, the staff in source A are described as having a poor attitude, which only flagged up the hotel's inadequacy even more. Source B uses an imperative "please bear in mind" to signal that this hotel is old and doesn't have a modern interior, perhaps to prevent prospective guests from feeling disappointed. So that is an example, really. And remember, this is just an introduction video. It's not looking at any proper GCSE extracts. But we're still using the same skills because these skills, these blocks of colour, will still be present in your question 4 response for the GCSE. So this video is all about practicing putting this all together. So you can see here that they're comparing, they're using their writer's methods, the language in green to support that, they're quoting as well, but they're also writing importantly about the attitudes of the writer, which is something that you wouldn't have done for question 2. For question 2, remember, you would have been comparing the hotels. Here, you're not, you're comparing the writer's views of the hotels. So there's an added thing to look at here, okay? So I'm just going to repeat that because it's important. For question 2, you would be comparing the hotels for this question. Here, for question 4, you're comparing what the writers think of those 2 hotels. So there is a difference, and the language tells you really what they think. So the inference comes from being able to work that out. Why do they think that? If you were in this hotel, why would you also feel the same as them, perhaps, if you were the guest staying in this hotel? So the bits that aren't coloured in here, you can see, are all about expanding on those ideas and trying to explain to the examiner why they perhaps have the views they do. So in summary, you need to make sure you are commenting on the feelings and attitudes of the writers in each source, and the feelings can be useful for that. The language that you quote will support this, and the devices. So the language is the clue as to what they think. Put it in shorthand. If they're feeling annoyed, they will use language to show that. If they're feeling happy, they will use language to show that. You could select quotes from the sources carefully because you think it gives you a good insight into their perspectives. But I've also heard of some colleges and schools saying to students that they should just highlight sentences at random and then try to ascribe attitudes to those sentences. So possible 2 ways into this, really. Sometimes texts are sometimes a little bit more clearer in what the writer thinks. Sometimes it's a little bit more ambiguous. But you will be able to do it. You just need to look very carefully. And finally, including a response, insight and inferences as to why you think the writers feel the way they do. What has happened to them that has fueled their attitudes? And why might you feel the same as them if you were in their shoes? So if you were staying in a horrible hotel, chances are you would also share the same views perhaps as the writer of source A. And if you can get into perhaps your own personal views, you might be able to expand on what the writer thinks as well, okay, as a way of prolonging or deepening your analysis. So that's question 4, okay, all about comparing the writer's thoughts, feelings, attitudes, perspectives of the topic of the extract. And it's the language that will give you the clue. Okay, thank you.